My name is Casey Hersch. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, author, and founder of LightYourSparkle.life. Many of you know that I have an autoimmune disease called Crohn's disease, which affects my gut and in particular my small intestine. I'm very excited today to interview Dr. Emeran Mayer for a second time about his new book that just came out this month called The Gut-Immune Connection. Dr. Mayer is a gastroenterologist, neuroscientist, and distinguished research professor in the departments of medicine, physiology, and psychiatry at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA, and the executive director of the G. Oppenheimer Center for Neurobiology of Stress and Resilience at UCLA. He is one of the pioneers and leading researchers in the role of mind-brain-body interactions in health and chronic disease. Let's get started. Dr. Mayer, when you published the Mind-Gut Connection in 2016, you showed us how the gut is so much more than a vehicle for waste and storage. In fact, there are hidden conversations between the brain, gut, and microbes that influence our health in significant ways. I was blown away by how much our emotions, stress, and adverse childhood experiences affect our gut health. In your recent book, The Gut-Immune Connection, you take us further into the Brain-Gut-Microbiome Network and help us understand why our gut health is so important for our immune systems to optimally function. You say that our modern industrialized society is changing our body networks, and this is why we're witnessing a public health crisis with dramatic increases in obesity, metabolic syndrome, brain disorders such as depression, autism spectrum disorders, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, autoimmune disease, and chronic illness in general. For many people, this information is still new. Can you explain for those who are hearing about these connections for the first time why they should pay attention and focus on ways they can improve their gut health and therefore their immunity, and why does this knowledge even matter?
Yeah, so to put this in a couple of sentences is not easy. And I have to say, I have come up writing my second book. I've come up with this concept by going through an extensive body of literature and talking to a lot of experts. And even though it seems simplistic to say that all these different diseases that seem unrelated to the public, but not only to the public, also to many of my colleagues, these connections are not obvious. But it became obvious that, based on our current knowledge, I can pretty much endorse this idea. We have a major factor in our lives, in our lifestyles, that is responsible or attributes a lot of the likelihood that you develop any one of these diseases if you have the genetic predisposition. And the explanation why the gut of all organs is at the center of that concept is because the gut is not this digestive organ only, even though that's a key function, keeps us alive. It is a hub, it's a network of the largest part of our immune system, the largest part of our nervous system outside the brain, the largest part of our hormonal system, the endocrine system. All these complex systems that are essential for our lives, for our health, are packaged into the gut in a way that they're not visible to an endoscopy. So a gastroenterologist who takes a look at it, you wouldn't see it. They're not visible to us unless somebody tells you that all this stuff is going on in your gut. You would have no clue. It's not even obvious if to a surgeon who cuts out a piece of your gut and looks at it, he sees essentially a piece of smooth muscle and some mucosal lining. It's only obvious if you do a deep dive into it with scientific methods, and you see that these 100 trillion microbes that live in our gut, particularly concentrated in the end of the small intestine and in the large intestine, they're just microns away from this complex network of different regulatory systems, the immune system and the hormonal system. So, and that's the separation is done in a I mean, any engineer would think this is almost impossible to do, but there's a thin mucus layer that in our gut is one layer of insulation, and then there's a tight layer of cells that makes up the gut wall. And these two layers are just like a few millimeters thick, separate our immune system that is very reactive to anything that is potentially threatening to us. And so if the microbes in turn are mainly influenced by two factors. One is the diet that we eat, because the microbes live on that diet as well, just like we do. And the other one is the information they get from the brain. So both the world around us, and our experiences, and maybe trauma, maybe positive, that are stored in our brain that influences the signals that go down into the gut. And then, as I said, the food that comes in, which is the nutrition for the gut, both of these influence the behavior of the microbes, but also in turn, the integrity of this barrier that separates us from the microbes. So this clever design by nature and evolution of having this really thin but very effective separation between the microbial organisms and our own cells, that layer is vulnerable to influences that come from either side. And then the other key concept is the immune system that's located in the gut doesn't just stay in the gut. So once you activate it, it will first affect inflammatory processes at the gut level that remain local. But in many cases, or in most cases, they spread beyond the gut because immune cells travel in our body, and the molecules that they produce, the cytokines, travel through our body and reach every other organ. So it's sort of the hub in our bodies that distributes information it gets from the brain, the environment, and our diet throughout the entire body to every cell, every organ in our bodies. So if anything goes wrong, either with our diet or with our brain, both of these systems then disturb this ideal situation in the gut, and it spreads to all the other organs. And that explains why either disturbances in our diet, which have obviously been dramatic in the last 75 years since World War II, but also the chronic stress that people are exposed to increasingly, that they are a major factor in the development of all these various diseases, even though, at first glance, you wouldn't think that Alzheimer's disease and colon cancer have something in common, but they do in terms of the immune system playing a big role in them.
That's very helpful. I mean, it's, as you say, years and years of culminations of research to try to bring it to a point where you can translate this for the public. And I think the biggest takeaway is that the gut is the home of all these important, like you said in the book, networks that are responsible for affecting all the different other parts of the body. And that's a new way of looking at the gut that we've not really viewed it before.
And it's, I always bring up this example that some of the first marine animals were essentially floating digestive tubes, this was a tiny tubular structure with a nerve net surrounding it. And that tube would take in water and nutrients at one end and would expel the waste on the other end. And there was a very close interaction of this nerve net that was wrapped around this tube with the activity of that, of that animal. So the animal was essentially a digestive tract. So that's how it started. You could say it's not a coincidence that even today the gut is at the center of many other functions that have evolved in evolutions and organs around it. It started with that structure.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, we know that people like quick and simple solutions, and the information on the internet and in bookstores is overwhelming and oftentimes really conflicting. Many people can't digest the science. So, what is the simplest way to convince someone who wants to improve their immunity? How their gut health and a diet that prioritizes feeding the gut microbes is actually a solution and not just a quick fix or another fad?
Yeah, what I would say is, or what I was, I'm recommending in my second book is, if you, and this seems counterintuitive in the beginning, if you focus on feeding your microbes the ideal food, then you pretty much take care of all the other needs of your organism, of your health. And that is, that goes back to the fact how this all started in evolution, that they play the microbes play the central role, but it also, I think it's pretty much consensus now from the microbiome science that a high diversity and richness of your microbiome is a key to its stability, its resilience against diseases, like even COVID-19, comes into play here. Any ecosystem like the microbiome, diversity is a key determinant of its ability to resist stress, perturbations, disease, infections, and also any of these other diseases that we talked about. So if you focus just on optimizing the health of this microbial ecosystem in your gut, it will accomplish everything else for you. It will generate signals, tens of thousands of signals to go to all your organs, to your immune system. It will, this diet, which is essentially a largely, not exclusively, but a largely plant-based diet, because that's what microbes are optimized on. They break down these fiber molecules and these antioxidant or polyphenol molecules into small components that are then being absorbed. It's almost like you don't have to worry about all these other complex things. Am I getting enough vitamins? Am I getting enough protein? Is the protein the right protein? Is the ratio, am I eating too much fat? Like you can almost, it's interesting, but you can almost forget about these questions and decisions because that largely plant-based diet that it's optimized for the microbes will have plant-based fats in it. So, you can even go on a plant-based keto diet if you want, which is still better for your microbes than the regular keto diet. It will generate all these antioxidants. The microbes will do that for you. They break down these molecules in all the fruits and berries, and it's medicine of the plants basically. So it's, you have to convince people of that basic concept that the microbes are not something that's either bad for us, as we have learned for decades about pathogens that can kill you. It's an ecosystem of beneficial microorganisms that, if you feed it well, can do the best for not only your gut health but your health in general. If you can convince people of that, that's the first step, I would say. Then the whole focus goes on. It's not helpful to be on the latest fad diet and take supplements. You might as well take just placebo pills. The same thing. If you change your diet in a way that we know is optimizing for these complex systems in our gut, and that's pretty unequivocally, proven by science and large-scale epidemiological studies, then it has to become a lifestyle. You don't have to worry every year when a new diet book comes out that you have to change it, or this was toxic and this was dangerous, and
Yes.
that's not going to happen. It's something that we've known for a long time. What we have to worry about is, where are these foods coming from? So even if you go on a largely plant-based diet, you have to know where it's coming from. Has it been treated with herbicides or pesticides, or is it, is it grown out of the soil in an agriculture or hydroponics? So that's the only thing that will keep changing, and there's a lot of emerging information that many of these artificially grown food items are not as healthy as the ones grown in a healthy soil are. But the basic diet, I think that is something, if you can convince people what these simple principles are, healthy diet, healthy microbiome, healthy gut, then I think that's half of the battle.
Yeah, and I think it's freeing. Your approach and focusing on feeding the microbes, for me personally, as someone who lives with Crohn's disease and has had gut problems as long as I can remember, a huge stress, I mean, that no one has been able to really answer throughout my life is how to eat. And so intuitively, I've always known there are certain diets that, end up eliminating a lot of certain types of plants. And then it's like, that there's a nutritional deficiency, there's a cost. So say you eliminate all the FODMAPs. What if you do that? I've tried that. Then what happens? You start to have nutritional imbalances in other areas because clearly you're not getting enough fiber, not enough vitamin C, and all the rich, antioxidants that you need in these other fruits and vegetables. So the idea that we focus on feeding the microbes, like you just said, I think does take away, especially those of us with chronic illness, some of that like worrying, because you focus on that, it makes sense. It's easy to do, actually. It's a lot easier to do than restricting yourself. Then it goes on and on and on. So much trauma around that. And you start to see that the whole body is going to respond, and you're not sacrificing one organ for another, one system for another, which is always what you're doing when you're in these sort of cycles of what's the latest fad.
Yeah, and so a very important component of all of this is, these food-related phobias or anxieties, which
Yes,
obviously,
that's my next question.
yeah, anytime you go on these restricted diets, you associate or you link food intake with anxiety or fear. You may actually think you're suppressing your anxiety by doing that, but it's simply a ritual to suppress an underlying anxiety, and that anxiety still works in your body. It's still there in your brain. You just try to hide it or deny it. A good example with this whole gluten frenzy that so many people think, that's it's bad for them. They're going to die earlier. They're going to get Alzheimer's disease. Is anytime they look at food, they go. I've seen this myself traveling in Spain or traveling home from a talk I gave in Barcelona. That a couple was sitting next to me and had this beautiful Mediterranean sandwich, and then they picked it apart and they put half of the stuff aside and then I dared to ask her, so why are you doing this? This looks like a really good sandwich. So no, we're gluten sensitive, and I said, do you have celiac disease? No, but it's toxic for us. And so just a visit to Spain, can you imagine? Every day they go out to restaurants in a Mediterranean country, they would go through that same cycle every time the fear comes up. And the fear doesn't stay in your brain. The fear goes down into your gut and affects the microbes and the gut lining and the immune system. So that's what these people don't understand. Anytime you have a restricted diet, you pay for it with the fear and the anxiety that's influencing your GI tract. And so this is a very important point.
Yes, and I mean, I personally relate to that in every single way, which is why one of my questions for you is, you know, what you were just talking about. Many of us have food allergies, and especially those of us who have these gut disorders. And once you have a food allergy, the experience sort of instills this fear toward food because you live your life focused on what you're not supposed to eat. And then, you know, we're afraid to consume nuts and dairy products and gluten, which are also in many of the recipes that you mention in your book to feed the microbes. So, the emotional relationship that we have between food and, you know, and our brain is something I think a lot of people don't think about. But at the same time, it's a barrier for people implementing the changes that might actually help them get better, because it's impossible once you've got that hook between, like, okay, I know that I'm allergic to this. I know that, you know, somebody somewhere along the line, a clinician, a physician, something told me that I shouldn't eat X, Y, or Z. So the moment that even I read these ingredients in your book, I feel the charge in my body. Like, oh my gosh, can I really do, you know, kefir, it's got some dairy in it. I feel that in my body. And I know from an energy medicine standpoint and also a psychology standpoint that that is a stress that goes in just like a stress over having a, you know, big exam or an interview, whatever it is, it still causes that fight or flight response in the body.
Yeah, I would say, you know, this is a very important point. I mean, the book was not written specifically for, you know, for specific patient populations. It's more like that, you know, everybody should kind of, this is a wide range of recipes that you could pick from, which we all know are gut friendly and microbiome healthy. But if you have a, you know, a definite food allergy, if you have a shellfish allergy or a peanut allergy, you definitely do not want to come close to these foods. And that shouldn't be sort of creating this underlying negative relationship of you towards food in general, because, you know, there's a couple of things. It's not like 100 things. Even though some people are made this are made believe that, you know, they do this testing and then it comes back with 50 different things that are allergic to, which I think is really a misservice to this individual. The true food allergies are limited in number, and, you know, if you're unfortunate that you had, you know, an early life programming of your immune system because of antibiotics or, you know, early life trauma, whatever, that you're more prone to these. It's not going to be 50 or 100 food substances. It's still going to be a handful of things that you learn, you know, you develop allergic reactions and you should not get close to them. It's a different story with the food sensitivities, because, I mean, they are heavily driven by the input from the brain. The brain can upregulate the sensitivity. You know, just thinking about is 90% of the nerve fibers that connect the gut with the brain are going in this direction. So there's a lot of sensing, and I mentioned this in my first book. The gut is our biggest sensory organ, and each of these senses can be modulated. It's like a system, an engineered system, that you can turn up the gain on each of those sensory systems, either in isolation or in general. So many patients, for example, with IBS have a generally increased sensitivity to many stimuli in the gut and in the world around us. We know where that is processed within the brain. But then with the food sensitivities, this can be specific to certain food items that you either associate with a bad memory. And once that's programmed, you will perceive, the brain will perceive this as a potential threat, and that triggers the fear response, and then that triggers the, you know, the stress response of the brain, makes it worse in your gut, changes the contractions and secretions. So I think for somebody who is suffering from these from these sensitivities, the best thing is to really, start out with a food diary, start out with a very non-restricted diet, except for those that you're allergic to, that truly allergic to.
Yeah, anaphylaxis kinds of allergies, exactly.
So then take a diary, write down if something triggers symptoms, then you stop that particular food item for a couple of weeks and keep monitoring your symptoms. If your symptoms then disappear, then you are sensitive to that item, and you should either decrease the amount of, for example, if it's milk or if it's yogurt or whatever, or you may want to eliminate it completely. Most people that I've worked with realize that once they keep this food diary, it's inconsistent. So sometimes you had a symptom from one food, another time from another symptom from another food. It depends if you ask them, in what context did this happen? Were you angry? Were you stressed? Were you worried? Then often it turns out it's really more that context that determines the sensitivity than the actual food item. But after a while, you come up with this personalized diet that is your specific, tailored diet that is optimized for you. And I think it gives you a sense of empowerment that you can say, from now on, I don't need to worry about it. I know exactly who I am, what my gut is, what my gut likes. And I don't have to go to the next book and find out, that I'm sensitive to this particular item that before I didn't know about. I'm sure the majority of people in the last 10 years, before they read the book, The Brain Grain, didn't even know what gluten is. They had no idea what it is. And but now it's in the consciousness of everybody, and it's associated with a lot of negative, experiences. I still believe that 90% of those individuals that don't have celiac disease, but have these reactions, that think they have these reactions to gluten, it's not a biologically mediated mechanism. It has a lot to do with that fear. And by eliminating this particular food item, it tends to suppress that fear, and then you do better. I think there's not a 100% consensus, unfortunately. There's colleagues of mine who have accepted this idea, and there's other colleagues, based on studies, that say it's just not, this hypersensitivity is not really food related. It's a food related fear that triggers that whole response.
And I appreciate, Dr. Mayer, that you bring this up in the book, and that you've just sort of gone a little bit to like another level of it with me, because I think there's an element of mindfulness that has to happen, and then also empowerment, because there's no doubt in my mind, just personally, that when there's a fear instilled in you, that it's in your brain. So then there it is. And when you've had a life of chronic illness, or you've done one of those blood tests that you're talking about, I was one of those. I did those one time many years ago, and I was allergic to all 99 items on the sheet. And I thought, oh my God, I'm going to die because I can't absolutely eat anything. So I have to pay attention to where those programs happen in my life early on. And intuitively, I know it's not possible for me to be sensitive to every single thing that I eat, or I would not have weight on my body and I wouldn't be alive. So there's sort of, I think it's just important that people pay attention to the physical piece and the emotional piece, and how both of them are very integrated. And as I've always believed, you have to find a diet that fits for what you can do for your own body, and be attuned to the things that bother you. Because I eat rice, and I know there's a lot of people out there who say you shouldn't eat grains with Crohn's. I've eaten brown rice since as long as I can remember, and I know it's something that definitely nourishes my body. So that for me is the most important information I can have. So,
and as you know, I've been talking about diet and inflammatory bowel disease or Crohn's disease. Until recently, there really was not any reliable large-scale study that had shown that any diet is either bad or good for Crohn's disease. I mean, there were all these recommendations, and we do know paradoxically, you know, that a diet that is completely devoid of any fiber, like an elemental diet, you know, where everything is sort of broken down into these small components that all rapidly absorbed in your duodenum, in your small intestine, that patients with Crohn's disease get better on this symptomatically when they have a flare for a while. But that doesn't mean that that kind of diet is the diet that you should stay on, like, for example, preventing the next flare of your Crohn's disease. And so for a long time, and it's to me, it's interesting, having been long enough in this, in the medical field and having seen patients. So in IBS, we recommended a high fiber diet like 30 years ago, 25 years ago. Now it's the opposite. Now it's the FODMAP, the low FODMAP diet. For IBD, we recommended the complete fiber-free diet, you know, that is all broken down. And I think now both of these opposite ends of recommendations are now tested for the first time in real life studies. And neither one of them is really the correct recommendation. I think it's the personalization. And, you know, this may change. I'm a scientist. I believe evidence, convincing evidence. So there are studies going on by very prominent investigators in the field. One is at UCLA, Dr. Limit Kai, there's others in the country. And they, for the first time, doing studies that will provide a basis to support evidence-based dietary recommendations for. But up to now, that's not been the case. You know, they're based on, like so much in this nutrition field is not based on the kind of studies that we require, for example, for allowing a medication, you know, where you have to put thousands of patients through it and it's to be randomized and double-blind controlled. We haven't had those for these dietary recommendations in diseases like Crohn's disease and even in IBS. But they are coming, and I think it will change. In the meantime, I think this approach that I'm favoring, the personalization of a microbiome targeted diet, that's what I would say is probably the best, most prudent approach for patients with these disorders.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that for sure. You know, you wrote the book during the pandemic, The Gut-Immune Connection. So, and you talk about how the pandemic shows us the ingenuity and unlimited power of microbes, these invisible organisms. You also make a plea for interventions that go beyond vaccines and say that we have more work to do if we really want to decrease our vulnerability to diseases. One of my concerns throughout the pandemic is there's been no mainstream attention on how to improve our immune system or increase our resilience so that we're not at the mercy of diseases. And I just wonder, do you believe in some ways the pandemic is nature's way of telling us that we've been doing something wrong?
Yeah, so I mean, this is obviously a non-scientific. I mean, I have this other part in my brain that is more the, you know, the philosophical, spiritual, speculative part of me, and I would answer this question with a definite yes. As a scientist, I would have to say we first need the evidence. Like, you know, there's so many studies that have been started during the pandemic to find out what the vulnerability factors are, and but there's a couple of things. I mean, we have I mean, two areas of that have to do with our, you know, with our food supply that directly relate to this question. So one is this heavy reliance in our food supply on inexpensive red meat. Obviously, it was one of the causes, is one of the driving factors of cutting down the rainforest around the world. Particularly, we know it about the Amazon in Brazil. And what this does, besides being a major factor in climate change, it also has narrowed the barrier between wild animals that live, which could be microbes, which could be, you know, other animals that carry these microbes or viruses, and ourselves. So the likelihood of something jumping over these, you know, the most common spread, for example, of these dangerous viruses recently has been from animals to humans, this zoonosis. And this is becoming more likely the more we reduce the distance between the wild part of nature and ourselves. And another thing that's happening is also related in some ways to this climate change. There's all these microorganisms that have been frozen and conserved in the soil of the Arctic with the thawing of the soil in these places, and that's ongoing in a rapid fashion, faster than anything else. There will be a lot of liberation of these organisms, and we have no clue at the moment which one of these organisms is going to be as deadly as, you know, the COVID-19. So that's sort of another source, and we see this with the breakdown of the barrier. We see it in Africa, getting closer to, you know, all these non-human primates, the apes on the Amazon. I don't know from which animals it would be the most likely this transmission, but we've seen several of these. And then inside our own country, in the Western world, our food supply is this mass production of inexpensive meat in these factories, essentially, and the way these animals are treated with antibiotics to suppress the normal microbial defense system. And you know, it's a breeding ground for the next pandemic. So some of these pandemics have come from, like the swine flu, from these, you know, animal factories, and so I think there's multiple ways that our lifestyle has affected our environment and our interaction with disease-causing microorganisms in our environment. That certainly makes it worthwhile reconsidering, you know, both our food supply, where it comes from, how it's grown, what we eat, but also to defend ourselves against these these dangerous or potentially lethal organisms. And that is to nurturing our own ecosystem. As we said before, you know, the more diverse and rich our ecosystem of microbes in the gut is, the less likely it is that a pathogen can enter and you know, cause a disease if it's entering through the gut. And then you know, so COVID-19 didn't enter our bodies through the gut. It does it through the pulmonary system, but a big part of it is the reactivity of the immune system to these infections. And these immune cells are programmed in our gut. So what we feed our microbes and how they then interact with our immune system in the gut determines how these immune cells, what damage they can cause at a distant site, like the lungs, like the, you know, the liver, any other part of the body. So I would say, to answer your question in scientific terms, lots of indirect evidence to support that in order to prevent the next pandemic, which I think the way we're going right now, all the energies have been absorbed with fighting it. And it's been a phenomenal success, probably the biggest success in medicine that I've seen in my career, to come up with these vaccines and saving millions of people, at least in developed countries for now. But I think there's much less thought and money invested and emphasis on preventing the next one, both in terms of changing the way we eat and how we interact with the environment, but also how we nurture our own defense system, you know, through this microbiome targeted diet.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I feel like the focus that we can have on our own immunity, knowing that so much of it lives in the gut, it just makes sense that you would, like you say, nurture our own ecosystem, because whatever happens down the road with these events that we can't control, and as the world changes, we have some ownership over our own bodies, and we can affect our own immunity by feeding the microbes what they need in order to create that diversity. Because I know that when COVID happened, there was obviously, we all know, the frenzy that happened. Of course, there were those people who already were dealing with gut issues, and then they knew that those who knew the immune system is in the gut were, oh my gosh, there's no way I can endure Crohn's. So I mean, not Crohn's, but with the COVID. And so there was a lot of fear around that. And then there was the obsessive amount of disinfecting and sanitizing, which I also like that you brought up in the book, the whole idea of the hygiene hypothesis. And so in some ways, now more than ever, we're disinfecting and using sanitizers. And we now maybe even have a greater fear of exposure to germs than I suppose we had before. And can all this sanitizing and germ focus be moving us in a direction away from where we really want to go in terms of our immunity?
No, absolutely. And, this question has come up in several conversations that I've had. So we don't have studies yet on that. Did the diversity, for example, of the gut microbiome take a hit during the pandemic? And it's particularly important because that excessive concern on hygiene is particularly dangerous for children growing up or infants growing up, because that's where the programming of the immune system happens. And so if you compromise the exposure, that's already one of the causes for many of these autoimmune diseases, that we have removed ourselves from, or our infants from, the exposure to organisms that don't kill us, but they cause certain diseases. There's H. pylori, for example. We've declared war on H. pylori, that also predisposing organism in the stomach. We don't know what the down the line the consequences are, because H. pylori have lived with humans for hundreds of thousands of years, and our immune system has been trained partially by this potential pathogen. But it's taught a lesson to our immune system. So we've removed many of these organisms, or just treat them with antibiotics early on in life, that are essential to teach the immune system of infants to differentiate between something that's harmful to us and not harmful. So now, with this even enhanced attention to hygiene during the pandemic, that danger is potentially even higher. I mean, one thing that has worked in the opposite direction, that the popularity of having pets, that has increased dramatically during the pandemic. So that's a good thing, because obviously having a pet in the household is one of these protective, interventions. So you're interacting with the microbes of that pet, but not being in the outside, not being in touching soil, or being touching plants or whatever, has definitely. And I still remember when it started, when we thought that when you buy something in the supermarket, you have to clean it for disinfect with the food.
Yes.
I mean, in some ways, that's for the microbes, that was a bad thing, because any microbes that got with the food before was kind of reduced or eliminated. So I would say there were the two influences, also that the whole hugging and kissing. I mean, I think in the families that was still going on. So you still had that exposure to the family microbial environment. But it certainly came to a standstill with other people. And I don't know, will we ever see that in the future? I'm sure there's studies going on that looks at the diversity of people before and after the pandemic. But it could have potentially increased our risk for that, for being more vulnerable to infections in the future.
Yeah. it's a lot to think about. I love in your book how you brought up a little bit ago the spiritual aspect. I think you bring up issues that would fall along the psychosocial, spiritual side that a lot of us have thought about. It's just nice to have you bring them up so it sort of validates some of these so-called maybe gut instincts that we have, and some of these bigger issues from like a macro level too, because you take us on this journey from our own sort of micro, organism world in our own bodies to the soil and the climate and where we're getting our food sourced from. So it was really refreshing to see a bigger picture of how we really are related and connected. And we all know this on some level, but you really spell it out beautifully and make us start thinking about a lot of these issues that we really need to be thinking about in this life. So
Yeah, and I would say, we always have I have these conversations with our son who says, I mean, most people are not interested in that. They're really interested in exactly what they should eat. They want to have a practical recommendation. They're not interested if there's a spiritual network. And, but I have to say, I just, for me personally, I think this is where this field is going to. This is the way our worldview is changing. So at least for a growing number of people, that they feel more connected to issues around the world. And so this whole, this theme of interconnectedness that I address the whole chapter to, that starts in the way our science is changing, the look at networks from genes to cells to other molecules to organs. Everything is organized with that same principle. It seems like this is a basic rule of evolution, that the networks get more and more complex, but it's always the same playbook. It's not that nature reinvented a new playbook or a new script for each of those stages. It's the same playbook from the very beginning on. And to me, that's just fascinating. And I think it's almost it's also empowering. I mean, once you understand that, you no longer see your own problems, your own health,
that's right,
your own food supply separate from what goes on a much bigger scale. And
yeah,
I think a lot of people are concerned now about climate change, but very few make that connection. Well, this is something very much related to what goes on inside of you if something goes wrong, and to the microbes, and to, so to me, that has been really important. I may lose quite a few people along the way that look for simple solutions of avoiding a particular food item, but that's not my message to the world.
No, and I completely agree with you, because when you started talking about the ecological systems perspective or the model, like, I was just in love with that, because my whole life, I mean, the root of my social work training, the very first week, we were introduced to the ecological systems model. And we had, charts where we showed how everything, when you see an individual, working with a client in therapy or social work, case management, whatever, they are connected to all these different systems. And we were always trained that it's rooted in biology and there's an interdependence. Everything affects everything else. But as a patient, who's interfaced with the medical system, and I'm also a social worker, I've always been in conflict, because it never made sense to me. Why am I a social worker? I know this. I studied this as biology. I studied this in my program, which is not, a science program, but yet I go to a doctor and there's no acknowledgement that I live in a system and that my body is also a system that's connected. In 2001, I had a laparoscopy procedure because the gynecologist, the GI specialist, the urologist and immunologist, and think all these specialists didn't talk to each other or see my body as a connected system. So everybody was in isolation doing their own thing. And during that laparoscopy, the gynecologist nicked my iliac vein in 3 places. And, I almost lost my life. It was a very severe medical mishap.
Mm.
But for me, that was just another lesson that my body is a whole and everything is connected. And I just appreciate that, a lot of us end up leaving conventional medicine and we go to these, you talk about the ancient wisdoms, Ayurvedic and traditional Chinese medicine that have been around for thousands and thousands of years, because we know, I think intuitively, that we need our body to be viewed as a whole. And even though, science, like you said in the book, is starting to return to that philosophy, despite the fact that the medical community may not be there yet. But I think we all, many of us, I speak for many of us who are at least living with autoimmune, we crave the approach that looks at us as a whole, and certainly how what we eat affects us. And spiritually, you get what you give. And we are, it's the book of joy. The Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu, I think, say it really, really well. We
Yeah.
have a shared suffering and we have a shared humanity and a shared healing. So
Yeah, and as you say, I mean, it's for thousands of years. I mean, you can go from indigenous cultures around the world to the major teachings in India and China, and all the way up to Hippocrates in ancient Greece, who all shared that same basic philosophy of interconnectedness. And it's only the scientific revolution changed that model for us, and the Western world has done really well. I mean, many things and many scientific discoveries and breakthroughs have been phenomenal based on that method. But now we're dealing with a lot of chronic illnesses, which is a different disease. We're not doing well, science is not doing well with dealing with chronic illnesses. We're doing well in coming up with medications that suppress symptoms and decrease mortality from these diseases, but we're not really making much progress of understanding why we get them. And it's because that model of interconnectedness is missing, and I think gradually now what I see happening in science, this revolution is happening in basic science much faster than in medicine, in all fields of science. It's the omics revolution. Everything is interconnected. It's not a single gene, it's a network of genes, not a single microbe, but it's a networks of microbes. And typically this takes a while before this gets into the medical curriculum, into the textbooks. This will take probably 10 years before even medical students are trained in these concepts. And until then, you'll have to deal with physicians that are either the ones representing the traditional medical system, which is very good in many things, but cannot relate to the connectedness aspect. And the other hand, you have a whole of unconventional practitioners that ranges from chiropractors to functional medicine doctors to naturopaths, and they have adopted this model of interconnectedness. Interestingly, they totally.
Sure.
But the details of what they teach is not science-based. So they've adopted the philosophy, but they've not. So I think what we need is really a merging of these non-traditional specialties with the mainstream medicine, and I think this will happen. This will happen the next 5 to 10 years. I would say it will take younger, and I see hope for that. Younger physicians, particularly students, and particularly female students, are much more receptive to that interconnected model of health and disease. And so it will happen. It just will take time. Too bad for patients that often are driven towards, I would say, non-evidence-based therapies and recommendations. But it's
yeah, and I think that hope is the most important message that comes from both of your books, at least from my perspective, because I think the more that there is this bridging between the two extreme communities that both have something significant to offer. And I feel like you're sort of in the middle of that. You talk about both both sides, which we've needed for a very long time, it's hopeful for me. And I watched a documentary called, which you probably saw it, The Biggest Little Farm.
Yeah. Great film.
I feel like, that that just says a lot about how we're all connected, and every like part of what's here on Earth has a purpose, including all of our human presence, our human presence. We're all here for a purpose as well. So I thought a lot about that documentary when I was reading the end of the book, Your Gut Immune.
Yeah, I love that documentary, and one that falls into the same category is the one Kiss the Ground.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yes. Which is it's kind of looking at different aspects of the same issue, and both of these. I mean, I know the producer of the Kiss the Ground movie. Who's a phenomenal person spiritually, and is passionate about spreading that message of interconnectedness of us with our food and the soil and the health of the soil. So there's progress. I think movies documentaries have filled a void in this process. They're promoting ideas and concepts that if they were just in books, not enough people would see them. Mm-hmm. But I think if they're promoted in beautiful documentary films, a large audience sees them and is affected by them, and thinks differently.
Yeah, for sure. Dr. Mayer, I know you have a few more minutes. I have one more question for you. That's just a personal theory of mine that I want to see what you think of it. So as a clinician and someone with Crohn's, I have many personal theories, I'm sure you can imagine, for why the body might attack itself. But one of my theories is that when you live with trauma or grow up in homes where you don't feel safe to be your authentic self, that in order to survive, there's this psychological phenomenon where you split yourself into different parts. So in many ways, you live your life as a false self, really hiding from who you really are. And for me, this has become a metaphor of your body really not recognizing you and actually attacking you as a foreign invader. And, I've seen this play out in my own therapy, and I've seen it play out in the lives of others, that the more that people become more in touch through therapy and life and passions and with who they are and living their lives with knowing themselves and not necessarily what other people think they should be doing, I do believe that it has eased some of my immune system's attacking on myself. And I'm just curious, what do you think that this is possible?
It is certainly possible. I mean, it's this whole, this whole specialty of psychoneuroimmunology, which surprising to me, it's always been surprising that has not become mainstream in immunology. But there's some amazing results from that field of showing how mental states can influence not just, like diseases, autoimmune diseases, but also how it affects specific cell types and gene expression, particularly, gene expression patterns. And this process obviously goes on all the time. What goes on in the depth of your mind will create outputs that go not just to your brain and become consciously aware of them, but also always go down into your body, into your, certainly into the GI tract to a significant degree, and change. So not just the contractions of the gut or the secretion that we know from our experiments, but also the behavior of immune cells and the reactivity of immune cells. Mm-hmm. And as I said, the gene expression of these immune cells. So even something like compassion or empathy, there's a very smart investigator at UCLA, Steve Cole, who has done many of the pivotal studies in this field, where they showed that a distinct gene expression pattern in immune cells exists, for example, in people with trauma. And that pattern is programmed into the memory of certain immune cells. So you carry this around with you so the trauma is not just something that's stored in your brain, it's also stored in a pattern of immune cell reactivity. And if that comes, if you're somebody who has that unique programming pattern of immune cells, if you're then exposed to some other dietary or environmental or chemical, insult or perturbation, then you're much more likely to develop this disease. And
Yeah.
so,
Yep.
so we know this, if this sort of becoming aware of things, certainly something that, having been in Jungian therapy for several years and sort of really liking this concept of individuation, that you
Yes.
find out all the different parts that are in your mind and that you integrate them into who you really are.
Yes.
That's definitely something I think that is health promoting. I haven't seen this. There's no studies on that. But it's something that, I mean, just imagine if there's opposite parts in your unconscious,
That's right.
that one is suppressed and the other one becomes overactive.
Right.
That's definitely a constellation in your brain that will generate signals to your immune system, to your body.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of science, I think, has not become mainstream, but I think it will at some point because it's so important. I think our current renewed interest in the immune system will make this kind of science more acceptable to a lot of people. That even though in the Western world, we still are more fascinated by if a particular toxin, environmental toxin, or a particular food item affects our immune system, I think I have no question that the things that come from your mind are equally important in this. And so what you have experienced, and I've seen this, so when I interview people, study participants in our, in our longitudinal study for Crohn's, from the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation, I always take a lot longer than my colleagues taking the history because I dive into these questions, and I've seen it many times. That this came out like what you said from your personal experience. So, yeah, my answer to your question is maybe not enough evidence yet to answer this 100%, but enough circumstantial evidence to say this is possible, and actually quite likely.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to, sort of some of the larger messages of both of the books that you've written. Having an awareness is super important. Once we're aware of our own emotional process, the thoughts that are in our heads, the way we respond to the foods that we eat, just having that awareness is the first step towards strengthening our immunity and knowing that there are certain things that we can do with food. You mentioned the Mediterranean, plant-based, not exclusively like you said, but focusing on how to feed. At one point you say these sort of unrecognized, invisible organisms in our body that haven't been getting the attention. Now it's time to give them some attention and do things that actually nurture and help them get their diversity. And then remembering that we're part of a bigger whole and that what we do on our planet really does matter. And you talk about One Health, and I think that's just beautiful. It summarizes everything, that we're all in this together, and what we do. It's not just what we eat. It's not just what type of medication we take. If you really want to have good immunity or overcome and live a quality life with some of these autoimmune conditions, you have to look at all the different facets of it in the big picture. And I've certainly found that with my healing. It went a lot further when I started really addressing the trauma component. And it will now go a lot further as I start thinking about how to feed the microbes with what they need.
What do you think? I mean, if I may ask you one question, what do you think was the most important thing for you as a patient that that changed the course of your disease, of all the things that you did medically or, self-awareness or changing lifestyle? Or
Yeah, I think I would have to say in the early years in my 20s, when I was really, really sick, when I recognized that I had to take some ownership over my health. And I stopped being at the mercy of everything doctors told me. If someone told me I was going to die and I took that in, then that did something to my physical health and my emotional health that brought me to a place of no return. So I first had to find that empowerment. That was a huge turning point for me. Like, despite what negativity might be around me and what conventional medicine sees statistically with this condition, I can be my own statistic. So it was very mental. And then looking at approaches, not just what am I going to do to not hurt, but how am I going to start looking at how to heal myself from the inside out? And that was very dietary for me. No artificial sweeteners. Just if I'm going to eat something, I need to know where it's from, and I need to know what the word is. What is it that I'm eating? And then the third piece that came later was, even as a therapist, I was very disconnected from how much my trauma history really played into my health. I was very physically driven, and looking at, how to help, really how that message in my body and the programming from my early years, had a big impact. And I have a long ways to go. I'm so far from being, symptom free or like out of the woods or really well, but I live a good life and I'm not getting worse. And I still have my organs, and I'm not taking immunosuppressants, and I'm 42. So
yeah, so you've accomplished a lot. I mean, I think what you're saying is, I mean, I couldn't have written this better. It's just like it's a real summary of what I would also say that I firmly believe in. And yeah, you're a superb example to demonstrate this, and having lived it, and be able to recommend this to other patients. I think it's...
Well, and Dr. Mayer too, the other piece is that a lot of people don't realize this. So say they do those things that I mentioned and they consider them, and that comes into their protocols despite their whatever age they are. Most people, I would say most people, I think there's a lot of people with trauma, but I really had all of the blows that you talk about in your books that line you up for these conditions. I had those and more multiplied by 100. I mean, I just didn't have a couple levels of antibiotics as a child. I had over 100 by the time I was, starting high school. I was bombed with antibiotics. So, and then you add the trauma, and then you add, other components that, I lived in the rural community, had access to soil, and I played outside, but more than most because I was in the mountains. But I still lived in a home where my mom, because I was so sick often, really protected me from germs. So did I really roll around in the dirt? I had pets. Yes, thank God I had dogs, and I rolled around with them. But my mom was really germ conscious. So the moral of my story that I want to impress upon people is that if I can be here at this age and be moving forward despite those blows, and many of them, then people who maybe have had one or two and not all of them have an even better chance if they adopt these protocols that you talk about. So, and I'm really passionate about that. I may never be able to escape that programming. I wonder sometimes, I want to keep hopeful, but there may always be a component of problems I have because it was really laid down hard in my early years. But, even then I'm still optimistic. So there's so much hope for people. And those who don't have autoimmune and want to change the trajectory, and those people in my life who listen to me and they say, okay, Casey, I'll listen to what you suggest. They see that there's benefits. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this couldn't be said better, like what you expressed just now. I think it's really wonderful, the way you see it. And yeah, some of the early programming you can't erase, but what I always said is, as humans, we have this this wonderful ability to override some of these biological handicaps with our prefrontal cortex, and the ideas and the concepts that we can develop, and the behaviors that can, so that we can really compensate for a lot of those. They're not going to go away completely, but you can compensate for them so you can have a good life. And
Yeah, and I think the things you can do to make your microbes feel safe. Because I have this like idea that the microbes are fighting against each other because I grew up in a home where conflict was the norm. And I really literally imagine that the microbes are like, we don't know how to interact without fighting and cussing each other out and hitting each other. So, I mean, safety on all levels, safety in my home, safety in the relationship I have with my husband, safety and nurturing from my pets that I love, my little Paso and Samba. Like anything I can do to tell my body from the outside in that I'm safe and I'm no longer, and even safe in my own immune system, with my own immune system. My immune system really isn't there to hurt me. It just, needs a little help to understand that it's also safe. It doesn't need to like fire off all the time. So there's like a huge mental component of seeing safety as the place I'm at right now and striving toward even more safety in my life.
Yeah, no, this is great. Really, thanks for sharing this.